I'm here tonight to address what I think is one of the most serious and potentially transformative issues facing our country today, the so-called Security and Prosperity Partnership. So what is the SPP? The SPP is the name given to an initiative sponsored by the executive branches of government and selected representatives of the corporate elites of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It essentially provides a blueprint for deeper, actually very deep, continental integration of the economies and security apparatuses, not apparati as I looked up, of all three countries. The SPP has been described as the umbrella under which hundreds of trilateral initiatives have been and are being assembled. Noted Canadian author Naomi Klein has called it NAFTA with spy planes. I have also heard it referred to as NAFTA on steroids, which is perhaps a more apt title given the present holding of the Olympic Games. Now, the SPP follows the continental conservative movement's political ideal of greater integration of the economies of North America that really gained traction with the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s, which, as we all know, notably comprised the following: the Free Trade Agreement between Canada and the U.S., the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, and these were intended to be followed by two other initiatives, one being called the Multilateral Agreement on Investment and the Free Trade of the Americas. Now, I say intended because both of the latter two schemes have been halted by a combination of factors, chiefly being widespread civil opposition when the details began to leak out and become known. So the SPP has really replaced NAFTA as the framework under which the transnational North American regulatory harmonization agenda is now moving forward. But unlike the FTA and NAFTA, which focused essentially on deeper integration of the respective countries' economies only, the SPP covers some 300 areas that cut into much broader subjects. Virtually every aspect of the social, economic, security, cultural, and other institutions of all three countries are included in the discussions. According to the U.S. citizen watchdog agency Judicial Watch, the SPP covers almost every subject imaginable, including healthcare, labor standards, higher education, science and technology, the environment, border security, civil rights, military procurement, natural resource policy, bulk water exports, a common North American currency and monetary policy, goods, services, and labor mobility, and corporate licensing and regulation, to name just a few. And all are targeted for discussion and ultimate harmonization. 9 trilateral working groups were originally established to address each of the 300 separate areas, to work out the details of how the three countries can achieve commonality in each of the areas. At its core, the SPP is a model of so-called partnership that envisions the development of market-oriented harmonization and convergence to facilitate seamless regional integration between the three North American countries. It is heavily private sector driven in both process and aim. The agenda is private sector harmonization. Very little in the way of state role or infrastructure is contemplated. A few examples of the breadth and profundity of the subjects under discussion may illustrate this. One is continental cooperation in the application of biometric and facial recognition identification for all citizens wishing to cross borders. Greater regulatory compatibility for goods and services, including things like food standards, labeling, and use of genetically modified products. Regulatory harmonization of pesticides. Our Canadian standards, many of you may have seen in the last few months, have been referred to as a trade irritant. Harmonization of pharmaceuticals and motor carrier and financial services. Indeed, one of the proposals is the so-called test once policy for drugs, which would have all three countries forego pharmaceutical testing and simply accept those results of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. As I've said, the SPP deals with a stunning array of issues from a social, cultural, public policy, and political perspective. While all other similar agreements have been heavily codified and subjected to what is known as hard law, like NAFTA or the more modern GATT agreements, where the actors hammer out very detailed agreements that are subject to detailed understanding, analysis, and adjudication, the SPP is not being reduced to a precise document with clear provisions that can be examined by citizens and other bodies. Not everything may be completely bad about these efforts. Some good work apparently has been done in identifying issues and productive steps in some areas. For example, information sharing in the areas of law enforcement, narcotics, firearms, and sexual and labor exploitation. Health issues facing respective Indigenous populations involving recommendations for health promotion, education, and research. And greater coordination on the prevention and control of the spread of infectious disease and pandemics such as avian flu, West Nile disease, and smallpox. But in any event, the SPP represents perhaps the largest incursion into Canada's sovereignty in recent memory. Of course, this presages one of the most serious problems with the SPP. Canadians and their elected representatives deserve to know what is going on at the SPP tables and determine how they relate to domestic policy making. Now, when did this begin? In my view, there are really two answers to this question, depending on whether we take a short or a long-term perspective. In the short term, the SPP is often traced back to the 9/11 incident, which many identify as the beginning of a renewed political impetus for a greater linkage between trade and security. Some of you may remember then Ambassador from the U.S. Paul Cellucci's pronouncement that this marked the beginning of a new area in which he claimed that security will trump trade. There was a political catch and reaction to this sentiment. The trade upon which Canada's and Mexico's economies depend could continue uninterrupted, was the implication, as long as those governments were willing to welcome the U.S.'s conditions, chiefly centered on the U.S.'s war on terror. Many observers noted that this caused many Canadian-Mexican business leaders, organizations, and think tanks in all three countries to leap to the fore, aggressively pushing their governments to give in to U.S. demands for integrated security in order to keep their goods and tourists flowing. In 2004, the Washington-based Council on Foreign Relations summoned an elite group of politicians and business leaders from all three countries to, quote, develop a roadmap for the future of the North American community. This resulted in a task force on the future of North America that became co-chaired by former Liberal Cabinet Minister and former Deputy Prime Minister John Manley and Thomas DeQuino, head of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. In their official statement issued in March 2005, these co-chairs proposed, quote, the creation by 2010 of a community to enhance security, prosperity, and opportunity for all North Americans, wherein the boundaries of the community would be defined by a common external tariff and an outer security perimeter. Note some of the lexicon used. Roadmap has been a favorite word used by the Bush White House in the U.S., being used to describe that administration's initiatives in the Middle East and other foreign policy matters. So you can see the etymology of the concept traced to the highest levels of the White House. The phrase North American community, which some see as an attempt to create an analogous identification in North America and in North American minds to the European community. Of course, as you'll see, there's extremely big differences between the European community efforts to create common markets and this initiative here. On March 23, 2005, U.S. President George Bush, Mexican President Vicente Fox, and Canadian Prime Minister Paul Martin, dubbed the Three Amigos by the press, met to discuss greater North American integration in Waco, Texas. These discussions produced a document called the Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America, hence SPP. Although brief and bare of details, this was not simply an empty wish list, but a goal-oriented document that established ministerial-led consultative groups to report back on achievable goals within a 90-day framework. The discussions also pledged regular progress reports and further meetings, culminating in further trilateral meetings held in Cancun, Mexico in 2006, Montebello, Quebec in 2007, of course this time with Prime Minister Stephen Harper reaffirming Canada's commitment that Paul Martin gave earlier, and New Orleans in April of this year. So, in the short term, the SPP was really generated by the 9/11 incident, which was used by perceptive business elites and right-wing political actors to advance their integrationist ideologies. In the long term, however, many historians and academics view the SPP as being nothing more than the latest incarnation of a long-standing continentalist integration movement that really has been present for the last 2 centuries. So what's the concern? As Stephen Harper has pointed out, isn't this simply about getting standardized regulations for the North American jelly bean? When asked if the SPP was a possible precursor to a North American Union, George Bush dismissed this as a conspiracy theory. Well, from a substantive point of view, there is great concern that the harmonizing will not lead to the adoption of the highest standards among the 3 jurisdictions. Indeed, there is great concern that standards will fall to the lowest common denominator. During the European Union negotiations, there was a strong and deliberate current to be aware of and preserve higher social, environmental, and worker protections. Many groups representing these interests were present and participants in those discussions. The SPP has no such imperative, and thus far there have been no seats at the table from anyone other than the corporate sector. So no environmental, labor, human rights, cultural, social, or humanitarian representatives have been or are bringing their views and interests to the SPP discussions. Now, there is already evidence of this race to the bottom happening in reality. Very intrusive, privacy-violating practices common in the U.S. surrounding transportation workers are already starting to be employed here in Canada. Another concern is the asymmetric power imbalances present between Canada, the US, and Mexico raise concerns that Canada will sacrifice its policy autonomy and regulatory philosophy. Therefore, it's of great concern that the SPP will enshrine lower social and economic standards with the relinquishment of sovereignty that would make future upward changes difficult, if not impossible. Note that I said earlier it is being pushed by the executive branches of government, by ministerial-led working groups. This is not involving the legislative branches. It is actually being driven by the Prime Minister and the Privy Council Office, who is directing his ministers, who are being aided by their senior-level bureaucrats. And on the other side of the table are the corporate elites. At each of the major meetings, Montebello may be recalled in Quebec, CEOs from the 30 largest multinational corporations in North America were part of the official summit. There were people there from Walmart, Chevron, Power Corp, Manulife, Lockheed Martin, Bell, Suncor, and Bank of Nova Scotia, to name just a few. What is most striking about the actors is how tightly coordinated the deregulation and harmonization agenda appears to be among business, executive-level politicians, and government officials. Big business appears to be driving the process. Political leaders are providing the policy direction and pace, and bureaucrats are taking care of the policy implementation, not your elected representatives. As can be discerned by now, The process of conceiving, developing, and administering the terms of the SPP is profoundly and almost unprecedentedly undemocratic. Structurally, unlike NAFTA and the FTA, it is not a treaty. It has been aptly described as an executive-to-executive agreement. Just think of Prime Minister Harper, President Bush, and the Mexican president coming together and signing a document, and that's about all the authority that's needed to get that document moving. It's now passed on to the bureaucrats who then implement it. Structured in this manner, it requires no legislative changes, hence little or no parliamentary involvement, and is also proceeding largely out of the public eye. There have been no bills proposed in Parliament concerning the SPP. There is no enabling piece of legislation that anybody can find. There have only been these vague executive agreements, but these agreements are not meaningless. They identify concrete goals and very tight timelines for measuring progress. So, not surprisingly, there's been accordingly virtually no parliamentary debate. Indeed, until this issue was raised by MP Peter Julian, who is the NDP Member of Parliament for Burnaby New Westminster, the SPP was not even raised in the House of Commons by the governments of Messrs. Martin or Harper. So, not only has Parliament been circumvented, on the few occasions that the SPP has been brought up, the government has actually thwarted its discussion. Some of you may recall the spectacle that happened in 2007 of Gordon Laxer, who is the head of Alberta's Parkland Institute, testifying before the Commons International Trade Committee in 2007. Now, Mr. Laxer is an accomplished academic and an expert on energy matters, and he was speaking on trade. Now, energy and trade are obviously things that one would think would be an appropriate issue to be discussed in an International Trade Committee of Parliament. He began to speak on the energy implications of the SPP from his perspective. He had barely started when the Conservative chair of the committee, Leon Benoit, demanded that Mr. Laxer halt his, what he called, irrelevant testimony. When the committee members, both Liberal and NDP, overruled Mr. Benoit, he abruptly and illegitimately adjourned the meeting and stormed out. What is remarkable, to tie this all together in a very alarming sense, about the SPP is that it has been effectively conceived and developed and pursued almost in an unprecedented fashion by completely bypassing Parliament and indeed any responsible, accountable or democratic process whatsoever. I think that if any of this is put before the majority of the populations of Canada or indeed of Mexico, maybe even the United States, they will not support the initiatives that are being pursued. And I think I have some evidence for this assertion. I think many of you in this room will recall the Free Trade Agreement in 1988 was actually rejected by a large majority of Canadians. More people voted for the Liberals and New Democrats, who campaigned against the agreement, than for the Mulroney Conservatives. It was only through the dubious magic of our first-past-the-post electoral system that we actually ended up implementing the very policy that the majority of Canadians clearly did not want and was a major campaign issue. It wasn't hidden like the SPP. It was campaigned on and debated and rejected. Many will also recall that the Chrétien Liberals actually campaigned in 1993 on the promise that they would renegotiate and, if necessary, abrogate NAFTA if elected, which in fact they were elected. Now, the fact that the Liberals reneged on their promise is perhaps the subject of another forum on democracy that I'd be happy to attend. I'd like to thank you all very much for your kind attention, and I look forward to discussing these things with you after.
First, we're going to want Don to propose some solutions as well.